Welcome back to Shameless Popery. I'm Joe Heschmeyer. Mel Gibson, the guy behind things like The Passion of the Christ, Braveheart, Signs if you're into sci-fi, he sat down on the Joe Rogan show and had a pretty fascinating interview. There were a couple of things that I really liked, and one kind of direction he went that I think is spiritually poisonous. So I wanted to highlight both what I think he nails and what I think he gets really dangerously wrong. First, what I think he nails. I think he boldly proclaims the gospel about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ in an easy-to-understand sort of 30-second soundbite.
I regard the Gospels as history. It's verifiable history. Some people say, oh, it's a fairy tale. He never existed, but he did. And there are other accounts, verifiable historical accounts outside the biblical ones that also bear this up, that yes, he did exist. And the other aspect of that is that all the evangelists, the apostles who went out there, every single one of those guys died rather than deny their belief. And nobody dies for a lie. Nobody.
Bear in mind, Mel Gibson's not a theologian. He's not an apologist. Maybe you might nitpick the way he says this or that. But frankly, in a conversational format with Joe Rogan, I think this was a great way of laying out a pretty thoughtful case, pointing to actual evidence. The Gospels are historical accounts. You got this extra biblical evidence, and he has that great line, nobody dies for a lie. And this, I think, it struck a chord with people, and I saw numerous people quote it afterwards. The second thing that he does that I think we would do well to remember is he is unabashed about standing up against corruption in the church, things like sexual abuse and deviancy and the like. And that, I think, again, if you read the comments, people are relieved to say, oh, look, a Catholic who's not afraid to call out, erring and malicious and abusive predators in the Catholic clergy. And so, if you're a Catholic watching this, you're probably like, well, yeah, of course. But bear in mind, people outside the Catholic ranks may not realize that you're as disgusted by those things as they are. So let that be known. However, Mel Gibson turns his sight not so much against just like the sexual abuses, but also against what he views as kind of theological abuses. And in particular, he uses the platform to spread a version of the kind of Sedevacantism that he's associated with. So I want to explain kind of Mel's case for Sedevacantism, what it is, and why it's a problem. So first, let's just start at the basic level. What is Sedevacantism? The name Sede comes from seat or chair, and it comes from the idea of the papacy, the chair of Peter, is vacant. There is, in other words, no true pope. You might not have picked up on that directly in the Joe Rogan interview because he hedges it a little bit. Things aren't what they seem, that kind of language. He doesn't explicitly just say Pope Francis is not the Pope, but elsewhere, he absolutely does say that. So, for instance, he wrote an open letter to Archbishop Vigano when Vigano was excommunicated, applauding the fact he got excommunicated and saying he doesn't think the Catholic Church that we all know as the Catholic Church, he doesn't think it's the real church.
I agree with you 100% that the Post-Conciliar Church of Vatican II is a counterfeit church. This is why I built a Catholic church that only worships traditionally. You are welcome to come and say Mass there anytime. Of course, being called a schismatic and being excommunicated by Jorge Bergoglio is like a badge of honor when you consider he is a total apostate and expels you from a false institution.
So I think that's clearer. There's different shades of Sedevacantism. Some people have said that there hasn't been a pope since Pius XII. Others will say since Benedict XVI. So, Pope Francis isn't a true pope. In terms of Mel Gibson, he comes from a family where his father was an outspoken Sedevacantist, a man by the name of Hutton Gibson, who was very clear that he didn't believe that there had been any pope since Pius XII, that from 1958 on, the Catholic Church has not had a pope, and that everyone from Pope John the 23rd forwards has really been an anti-pope. And not only, more than just an anti-pope, he's also going to argue they're spies. Now, I should caveat here, obviously, a father's views aren't automatically his son's view. Not many of us would want to just be associated with every theological or political view of a family member. But in this case, not only is Mel Gibson saying a lot of the same arguments that his father was on record making, but he also, in the Joe Rogan interview, talks a little bit about both his esteem for his now late father and kind of the influence he had on him religiously.
As a child, one accepts things on faith because, you're raised by people who are nice to you and they believe it. And my dad was a pretty smart guy. He was like Mensa smart, like real smart. Like back in 1968, he won Jeopardy, right? And then
Really?
And then they brought all the Jeopardy winners back, and he played all the winners, and he beat all of them too. So he had a mind like a steel trap.
So Mel Gibson's father was, by seemingly any measure, a genius. And he used his genius intellect to argue for the idea that the only true Catholics on earth were those who rejected the Pope and the visible Catholic Church. In his words, all the faithful, so every faithful Catholic, quote, will have nothing to do with the post-conciliar heretical structure or its anti-popes. They do not recognize heretic Montini, Paul VI, as Pope. They do not accept heretic Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, as Pope. So it's not just that he doesn't think they're popes. He doesn't think you're Catholic if you think they're Pope, because all the faithful reject them. And in fact, he doesn't just think, as I said, he doesn't just think they're anti-popes. He's convinced they're actually spies put there, at least in one case, by the communists. So he's convinced that John Paul II was really a communist spy. He made this claim on the radio in 2010, and he's made it elsewhere as well.
You're looking from a devout, traditional Catholic position at John Paul II. What do you see?
He was a complete plant. He was a Russian agent or a communist agent from the beginning. He's the only bishop that could get out of Poland without any trouble during the communist control.
So again, Hutton Gibson is making these claims in 2010, decades after John Paul II helped to bring down communism in Europe. He helped organize resistance to the USSR. He helped to kind of organize what became known as the Polish Solidarity Movement. He helped to, bring down the Iron Curtain. But apparently, Hutton Gibson argues, this was all because of a communist plot to bring down communism in Europe. I don't know how that reasoning works, but I highlight it to say this is one of the things that can make the Sedevacantist debate really tricky. The people who believe in this stuff tend to be committed to certain positions on not any clear evidence whatsoever, often just repeating rumor and innuendo, even when those rumors and innuendo fly in the face of everything we know. Like, we have plenty of evidence that John Paul II was outspoken against communism, but we're supposed to believe that he was secretly a communist. Those kind of things. That makes this debate kind of tricky because it can be hard to find fruitful common ground. But I'm going to do my best to do that, looking at a couple aspects of why Mel Gibson believes Sedevacantism is true. In his own explanation, again, as he gives it to Joe Rogan, I realize it's not like a technical treatise or anything like that. Fair enough. Additionally, I should say this at the outset. Some people just believe the Pope isn't the Pope because they think he fell into heresy. They think he got something wrong on doctrine. I understand a lot of the doctrinal questions. I understand a lot of that theological stuff is tricky. That's usually a weak case, meaning if you're a Catholic and you say, I disagree with the Pope on X, that's usually not a sign that the Pope is wrong, particularly if he's speaking in an authoritative, magisterial sort of way. There's a lot of caveats and things we can go into and all of that, but I want to focus instead, because that's not the case that Mel Gibson makes. He instead makes the case that we don't think there's a real Pope because there was a fake election, that the papal election in 1958 was a sham, and this kind of disrupted the whole chain of popes since then. This is rooted in what is sometimes called the Siri Theory or the Siri hypothesis. And if you're wondering, this has nothing to do with the question of whether your devices are listening to you. I'm all in on that conspiracy theory. That is obviously true. It is instead the claim that in 1958, the papal conclave that allegedly elected Pope John the 23rd actually elected a different guy, Cardinal Giuseppe Siri. And so this theory is based on a real fact, and that real fact is on day one in the morning of the papal conclave, the smoke looked white at first instead of black.
First, there was an event in the Vatican where they elected John the 23rd Pope, right, in 1958. I was 2 years old, right? He was elected, and there was a very funny thing that happened in the conclave. Usually there's white and black smoke that goes out of the chimneys to tell you, we have a pope, habemus papam, and the white smoke came out. And everybody cheered, and they went crazy. And then about a half an hour later, black smoke came out. That never in history has that happened, that the white smoke came out, and then the black smoke came out.
White smoke means we found a new pope. Black smoke means no pope.
That's right. They'd have votes, or there'd be one reason or another they'd have a round. in the conclave, and black smoke would come out many times maybe. Maybe it would take 2 weeks. But never was it known that white smoke came out, then black smoke came out.
So what was the scenario?
That somebody was elected, and that maybe something else happened, and he was pushed aside and someone else was put in. So it was
Power struggle.
some kind of power struggle.
So as I say, there's a little bit of common ground that we have on this. In 1958, on day one in the morning, there really was smoke from the Sistine Chapel that at first looked white. It was just kind of a trickle of smoke. And then one of the priests covering the conclave for Vatican Radio even got excited and announced, it's white, we have a pope. And so people living in Italy were convinced, okay, we have a pope. But then a few minutes later, there's more smoke came out and it was very clearly black. That's from the news reports the day of. So that's where we all kind of agree. There's two possible theories for this. One theory is simply that smoke signals aren't exactly the most sophisticated technology. Despite Mel Gibson claiming that never was it known that the smoke would go from white to black, confusion over whether the smoke was white or black or going from looking white to looking black is actually something of a recurring phenomenon, as you can see from this 1978 footage of the papal conclave that elected John Paul II. This is 20 years later, and you see the same thing happening. It starts off looking kind of black to looking gray to then looking white. And you see the crowd kind of rejoicing. I've got the sound off, but you can hear people rejoicing in St. Peter's Square. And then the smoke goes back to very obviously black. Now, what's going on here? Well, there's not really a controversy as far as I know about what happened in 1978. It's just the problem of trying to use smoke signals to communicate papal elections. To make black smoke, you burn up the cardinals' voting ballots. Plus, you added an additive. At the time, you would use something like tarry pitch. But the problem is, if the ballots burn up first, the smoke's going to look white at first. Or if the pitch isn't over all the ballots, right? Like if you get something where there's not pitch being burnt, it's just ballots, it's going to look like white smoke. And this was such a recurring problem that in 2005, the Vatican actually stopped using tarry pitch in favor of a more reliable chemical method to make black smoke. They also, helpfully, now ring the bells of St. Peter's if the smoke should be white. So if there's an election of a pope, you're not just left, particularly at night, trying to decipher, does that smoke look more white or black? This is like a monochromatic gender reveal. It doesn't work very well because you're using some pretty old school technology, we'll say. So that's one explanation, right? The reason you have smoke that looks white at first is it's their first time doing it. It's day one. It's their first attempt to do it. It's not a very precise mechanism. And this is something that we know as a matter of history had been screwed up multiple times. Even the prior papal conclave, when they wanted to have white smoke, it was more gray looking, and they had to then have the guy helping run the conclave go and announce to Vatican Radio, oh yeah, we actually did elect a pope, because the smoke was ambiguous. So that's, one, I think, straightforward explanation. But there is another explanation, and it's the one that Mel Gibson is pointing to, that there was a power struggle or a power grab. And in particular, allegedly, the reason the smoke looked white for a few minutes on day one was because the cardinals had actually elected a pope, a secret pope, Cardinal Giuseppe Siri. Now, Hutton Gibson, Mel's father, it claimed that he was duly elected, but then was forced to step aside by conspirators inside and outside the church. And these shadowy enemies threatened to atomic bomb Vatican City. Now, to be clear, Hutton Gibson is not basing this off of anything Cardinal Siri said. Cardinal Siri never claimed anything of the like. He instead appears to be indebted to the work of an American layman by the name of Gary Jouffre, who came up with this theory in the 1980s.
Cardinal Siri, a prelate of great renown as a negotiator and peacemaker between labor and management, evidently fit the Masons' need to the letter. Moments after his election on 26 October 1958, Siri was persuaded in a most brutal fashion to step aside in a forced papal abdication known by all present to be completely invalid. Masonic cardinals had even voted for him to ensure his election and acceptance of office, only to demand his immediate resignation 5 minutes later by threatening to annihilate the church. They then offered peaceful coexistence between the church and her persecutors if a compromise candidate could be found as a caretaker pope. The conclave had been vitiated, and 2 days later the caretaker turned out to be Angelo Roncalli, a mouthpiece for the Masonic agenda who was sought by the forces of Antichrist to head the church not as pope, but as anti-pope. In this way, they hoped to perpetrate a death grip on the church's structures with a succession of figureheads devoid of any guidance by the Holy Ghost. For only by subjugating a true pope who was unknown to the outside world and replacing him with a false shepherd would the Freemasons arrive at the total realization of their goal.
So let's unpack the Siri theory and looking at several different dimensions of it. First, you've got just the logistics. One of the problems with the theory is that in modern history, no pope was ever elected that quickly, meaning everyone should have been cautious of the idea that within the first 2 ballots on the morning of day 1, they'd already elected a new pope, because you need a 2/3 majority or 2/3 plus 1, depending on what period of history we're talking about. And if you go all the way back to 1700, and I think you can go even further than that, you'll find that the fastest the papal conclaves had ever worked was 2 days, and that was 2 easy candidates. Pope Leo XIII in 1878 and Pope Pius XII, the one who just died, in 1939. Both of those men, prior to becoming pope, had been sort of the right-hand man of the pope before and were already well-known, beloved figures. They were obvious kind of shoe-in candidates for pope, and it still took at least 3 ballots and 2 days of voting. But we're to believe that on the morning of day 1, 2/3 of the cardinals had already settled on someone, and moreover, that they'd settled on Cardinal Siri. Now, you might ask, why Cardinal Siri? There's no explanation given other than he seemed like the right fit for the Freemasons. But if you think about it for a few moments, he doesn't seem like a good fit for the Freemasons at all. He's an outspoken conservative traditionalist. There's a reason he's beloved by Sedevacantists, because he stands for all this stuff that modernists hate. And we're to believe that 2/3 of the cardinals got in there and immediately decided on that guy, even though he wasn't the obvious choice prior to the papal conclave. I know his name had been mentioned. He wasn't the sort of Pius XII kind of figure where it was the right-hand man of the Pope before him. He didn't have that role in his relationship to Pius XII. So that's already something that should set up some red flags. Like, how likely is it that they had a proper election that quickly? And why in the world would the Masons be voting for a guy who is really anti-Freemasonry if you accept all this theory? The second problem is, okay, think about the bad guy's plot here. You've got, depending on who's telling it, Freemasons or communists or modernists or spies of some kind. And these guys are apparently ruthless kind of movie villains. They're willing to nuke the Vatican if they don't get their way. They're willing to do something. Again, the details of the plot are vague and seems to depend on who the storyteller is. Assume for a second that that story is right. And just imagine it, if you will, as a Hollywood plot. You've got the villains, and they want something. They want to take over and control and subjugate the Catholic Church. What would the obvious plot be? Well, just install a pope of your own, right? Like, if you can force all the cardinals to do your bidding, which the Siri theory has to presuppose, they got all of the cardinals involved to lie about who the pope was. Why couldn't they just have all the cardinals involved elect their guy as pope in the first place? And you don't have to have all the lies and everything else. In fact, you wouldn't even have to, announce on the floor, we've got a bomb and you've got to vote our way. You could just do that to 2/3 of the cardinals plus 1 and win the papal election that way, seemingly. So the whole Siri theory is bizarrely convoluted. We're to believe that they don't install their guy. Instead, they, for some reason, install a guy they hate, Siri, who they then let be pope for 30 minutes when he doesn't come out on the balcony for some reason. And then they tell him he can't be pope. Or at least he can be pope, but he has to pretend he's not pope so they can install a caretaker anti-pope. And Siri, this Catholic traditionalist, is just fine, apparently, going along with this, again, convoluted plot of electing a false guy as pope in what he now knows to be a sham council. And the obvious question is, Like, why are any of these things happening? And this theory doesn't do a good job of explaining those details at all. Like, why is Siri going along with this? Why is anyone else going along with this? Why are the bad guys doing this in the first place instead of just electing their own guy? The closest you get is Jouffre suggests, well, they need a real pope to be there because if you have a real pope, you can't elect a new one. And so you need Siri, ironically, to stop, the election of a true pope. Now, that theory fails for a lot of reasons. I'll explore those in a second. But I want to let Jouffre kind of lay out the theory.
The true pope, who had vainly hoped to prevent a catastrophe for the church by delaying his public claim to office, brought about something far worse instead. For as long as he lived, his very existence prevented the election of another true pope. He was mocked at his election, which was repeated and again suppressed at successive conclaves.
Okay, so again, assume that this theory is right for a second and see if it makes any sense. You need Cardinal Siri to become Pope Siri because then you've got a valid pope, so you can't elect a new pope. So then you can't have a real pope to rival the anti-pope. Well, one obvious problem is you already have a real pope to rival the anti-pope in this scenario because Siri is the pope. We're told vaguely that he's just decided to delay publicly acknowledging it, but he doesn't delay. He never claimed to be pope. That was not a delay. He just never said he was pope. And not only does he never say he's pope, as we're going to see, he happily participates in the Second Vatican Council. He acknowledges Pope John the 23rd as the pope. He contributes to future papal conclaves. So we have to believe, on the one hand, that Siri is this good, holy, orthodox, traditional cardinal who becomes pope, and that he's a total moral coward who, for fear of, death or destruction or something, basically apostatizes, like pretends a false pope is the real pope, pretends a false church is the real pope, and while being pope, actively works to undermine the church for the sake of an anti-pope. And why? It's totally unclear kind of why this happens in this scenario. Now, again, go back to the crux of the theory. You need Siri to be pope because that prevents anyone else from becoming pope. Siri could defeat this plan easily in two ways. One is just publicly saying he's pope, and then the other cardinals be like, yeah, he's the pope. Plenty of people have threatened to kill us in the past, the communists, the Nazis, all the way back to the ancient Romans. And we don't deny the faith just because it's inconvenient or maybe fatal. Like, we don't give up the spiritual good for the sake of the biological one. Fine, some people are going to renounce the faith under pressure, but to accept this theory, you have to believe every single cardinal apostatized, basically. But the other way he could defeat it is he wouldn't even have to announce he's the pope publicly. Under canon law at the time, all he had to do, and today as well, all he had to do was resign. No one has to even officially accept it. He could just say, okay, I'm no longer pope. He could tell the other cardinals in the room, the only other people on earth in this theory who know he's the pope, he can just say, all right, I'm not the pope anymore. And now they can go and elect a real pope. Remember, Cardinal Siri participated at future papal conclaves. So if he was for some reason really worried about John the 23rd, he could just wait till John the 23rd died and then say, I resign as pope. Now you can have a clean papal election. There's even historical precedent for this. In the Great Western Schism, which we're going to talk about in a second, Gregory XII resigns as pope to avoid any confusion over who the pope is, so the church can just have a clean papal conclave with no dispute about who the authentic pope is. So he could have done that very easily and defeated this whole convoluted plan, but he doesn't. And no cardinal present says, hey, we actually elected a different guy. I remember very distinctly. We even set up the white smoke, which, by the way, is another huge problem with this plan, right? So remember, according to this plan, the terrorists have decided that they're going to elect Siri just long enough for him to accept the papacy so that then you can't make somebody else the pope. Fine. Accept all that theory. Why in the world would you let them send up the white smoke? Like, why have this 30-minute gap where the smoke looked white if what you want is for only the guys in the room, the College of Cardinals, to know he's the Pope and you want no one else on earth to know he's Pope? Send up black smoke right away. But that doesn't happen according to this theory. Like, the whole theory is premised off the fact that the smoke looked white. And if the theory is true, why would the smoke have looked white? It doesn't make sense. Why would, like, that's such an obvious, it's like tripping the alarm if you're robbing the bank. You don't let the alarm go for 30 minutes and then say, turn it off now. This would tell the whole world there's a pope. Plus, you would expect in that time, if there really was a pope, that Siri would have gone out, as popes often do, to the balconies and greet everybody in St. Peter's Square. He doesn't do that. Again, the more obvious reason why is because he hadn't been elected pope. But according to this theory, it's totally inexplicable. If they're holding them all hostage, why are they letting them send up white smoke? Okay, so those are some of the problems with the theory. There's a few more. Cardinal Siri, as I alluded to before, was an active participant in the Second Vatican Council. And he's, in an interview in 1963, talked about how it may take 50 years for us to fully appreciate the Second Vatican Council, and that as the Holy Father himself indicated, the approach is a pastoral one. Who is the Holy Father in question there? Well, very clearly it's John the 23rd, who'd spoken about the pastoral nature of the Second Vatican Council. Elsewhere in the interview, he refers to Pope John's Mater et Magistra as a papal encyclical. Now, according to this theory, all of these are calculated lies. He's supposed to be saying this while he doesn't think John is Pope. He doesn't think Mater et Magistra is an encyclical. He doesn't think the Second Vatican Council is a council. Why is he doing this? We're told vaguely it's like it's some plan to protect the church. He's lying to everyone about who the Pope is, which are and aren't ecumenical councils, and what are and aren't papal encyclicals. But that theory doesn't even make internal sense. Like, no matter how good or bad you think cardinals are, this whole theory is so convoluted and involves people to act not just in malicious ways, but in truly irrational ones. The good guys and the bad guys alike are acting in ways that don't make any sense. So that's the first kind of big picture problem with the Siri theory and that view of Sedevacantism. There's another dimension to it as well, which Mel Gibson mentions, which is that it's not just the smoke that has led them to this. Because remember, they've gotten from, that smoke looked white before it looked black, to this whole convoluted theory about, secret terrorists in the Vatican, and Cardinal Siri being like, why would you think Siri was the one elected? Other than just pure wish fulfillment. All of that stuff. Like, all of that is just based on a couple slivers of evidence. One of those pieces of evidence is the smoke looked white and then it looked black. That's true. It's much more easily explained, but that is a true piece of evidence. The other piece of evidence is that Pope John the 23rd took the name John the 23rd. And we're supposed to believe that that is a signal that he's an anti-pope.
Of course, the man who came out was a man called Angelo Roncalli, and he was John the 23rd. Now, it's interesting to note that never had a pope taken the name of another pope ever before in history.
Once again, he's claiming something has never before happened in history that happens a lot. I mean, remember, his name is John the 23rd because 22 other guys had taken the same name before him. So the idea that no pope's ever taken another name before, that it's the same name as another pope, anyone who knows anything about the papacy knows that's not true. I think he's just misspeaking here. I think what he's trying to say is not that it's a problem that he took the name Pope John, but that he took the name Pope John the 23rd for this reason.
This man took the name of a known anti-pope from the 15th century that Cosimo de' Medici put in there as his own man. I'll get you in the chair and then everything will be rosy. Everything will go good for business, whatever he was putting him in there for, some corrupt reason. But, and there have been corrupt men in that place before. I mean, there's Alexander VI and Julius II and Sixtus IV. I mean, some of these guys are, they're not saints. So he took the name of a known anti-pope from the 5th century who actually said, yes, I'm an anti-pope. Sorry, I'm not the right guy, because there was more than one, and he confessed to being, and he wanted to, square things with the Almighty, I guess, so he confessed to being an anti-pope. And so he took the same name as that guy, John the 23rd. So it's interesting, don't you think? I mean, why would he do that?
But even if the objection is, he took the literal same name of an anti-pope, that is something that had happened multiple times in history, and he's just factually wrong about this. So anti-pope John the 23rd, he arises during what's called the Western or Papal Schism, this period from 1378 to 1417. And there are actually 7 different guys who claim to be pope but aren't. 5 in Avignon, 2 in Pisa. And all 5 of the ones in Avignon, Clement the 7th and 8th, Benedict the 13th and 14th, 2 guys that take the name Benedict the 14th, neither of whom were actually Pope, all of those names get reused by later popes. So you have a fake Clement the 7th in the 14th century, and then you have a real Pope Clement the 7th in the 16th century. Why? Well, because we don't accept that those guys were really the Pope, so their names they don't count. You know, if you're thinking about, okay, I want to take the name Pope John, how many Johns have there been? You don't count the anti-popes in that list. And so all John the 23rd does is the exact same thing Clement the 7th, Clement the 8th, Benedict the 13th, Benedict the 14th did when they took their papal names. They're taking this name that an anti-pope had tried to claim, and they're not recognizing the claim because the guy doesn't have a real papal name because he's not a real pope. And John the 23rd is actually pretty clear about this. He's not trying to honor anti-pope John the 23rd. He's taking the name because he doesn't recognize him as legitimate. When he's discussing, and one of the very first things he talked about was like why he took that papal name, which is a pretty common thing. You know, when a pope becomes pope, you ask him, why do you choose that name? And he's very clear that he wanted to honor his father. He wanted to honor St. John's, the church that he grew up in, and he wanted to honor the 22 Johns of indisputable legitimacy. Notice, which John is he not mentioning there? The one who isn't of indisputable legitimacy, the false John, anti-pope John the 23rd. So he's not honoring him. He's treating him the same way prior popes had treated the Avignon anti-popes, as just saying, you don't get to have this name because you're not really the pope. So it's a very strange thing to criticize him for. It would make much more sense to criticize him if he'd taken the name John the 24th, because then you'd say, wait, are you acknowledging the legitimacy of anti-pope John the 23rd? That would make sense as a critique. It makes no sense as a critique that he doesn't acknowledge an anti-pope's legitimacy. All that to one side, the whole theory that John the 23rd is an anti-pope and he's like leaving a little Easter egg by taking a former anti-pope's name. Why would he give a little clue to everyone that if you go far enough down a rabbit trail, you'll realize, wait, is he telling us he's the anti-pope? Why would he do that? Even as a theory, it doesn't make a ton of sense. Okay, so all that's to say, the Siri theory and all of its kind of related forms is built on evidence that is flimsy or outright false and requires everyone involved to behave in ways that make seemingly no sense. It goes against all of the available evidence. That no one involved in the 1958 papal conclave thought that they'd elected Cardinal Siri as pope. Nobody. And nobody expected them to elect somebody on the morning of day one if they knew anything about papal history or how long it takes at conclaves. That just is, like, the whole theory is built on not just straws, but on, well, it's kind of up in smoke. What about a positive case, though? Because I think it's easy to get overwhelmed in these conversations. You've got somebody who's gone really, like, way too far down the rabbit trail into some internet deep dive about, you know, arcana and like, oh, here's the secret history of the Vatican. That can become really overwhelming to know, like, how do you talk to someone about that? Do I have to read 50 different articles alleging different theories about who really the Pope was in 1958 or all of these things? Do I have to debate the theological merits of everything that happened at Vatican II or in the wake of Vatican II? I would suggest no, and I don't even think it's healthy to try to do that, particularly if you're talking to someone as brilliant as Hutton Gibson, who's just settled on an idea that's obviously wrong, but it probably is smarter than the people trying to correct him. It's very easy, right? It's very easy to end up in a situation where you become fixated, even as a very intelligent person, on a totally false theory. And the problem is it's very hard to kind of pull people away from that. I want to give one way that we can go about trying to do that. And I'll give the caveat that it's going to have kind of mixed success. But the positive case against Sedevacantism is not just that it's wildly implausible, but that it's actually theologically impossible. For a few reasons. I'm going to lay it out as a syllogism. The first premise is just this. If the line of popes from Pope John the 23rd to Pope Francis today is not valid, then we can never have a pope again. So, if the Sedevacantist theories are true, it's not just that we don't have a pope, it's that we never can have a pope. Why is that? Well, Because to have a pope, you need two things. Number one, you need valid electors. And number two, you need a valid electoral process. And you and I cannot make cardinals. We cannot make electors of the pope. We also cannot make an electoral process for the church. This is something that is laid out by successive popes. They will lay out the electoral process for future papal elections. So, for instance, when we're talking about the 1958 election of John the 23rd or Pope Siri, depending on which view you take, that's governed by Pope Pius XII's document. He has an apostolic constitution explaining the electoral procedure. There's only two things you need to know from that. Number one, it is required, legally required, that the next conclave happen within 18 days of his death. Number two, the only people allowed to vote in it are cardinals. Pretty obvious, but that's a recurring part of this, that no layman, no non-cardinal priest or bishop, no king, no whatever else can vote. Only cardinals can. Okay, so now consider the implications of that. The death of Pope Pius XII was October 9th, 1958, which is significantly more than 18 days ago. And the actual 1958 conclave happened 16 days after. So even if you want to say, okay, well, maybe they secretly elected Pope Siri. Well, he died in the 70s. And in fact, all of the cardinals who were appointed by Pius XII or before died by the end of the 1970s. So what's the problem? Well, number one, you can no longer hold a legal election because you've missed the window of time. And number two, even if you tried to hold an illegal election, you don't have anyone to vote in it because you don't have any cardinals except for those that you allege were created by anti-popes. So there's nobody to vote and nowhere to vote. There's no conclave and nobody to participate in a conclave or to call one or anything like that. You hopefully see the problem. So we end up with this situation where it becomes impossible. If the Sedevacantists are right, it's impossible to ever have a pope ever again. This has led some Sedevacantists to try to just say, well, let's just illegally elect a pope. Because we can't do it legally, because clearly we miss a window and we don't have anyone who can legally elect it. No cardinal agrees with us that there's not a pope. And so you'll see these kind of grasps at straws to create their own pope. Maybe the most famous of these was anti-Pope Michael I from here in Kansas. He claimed to be elected by his mom and dad and 3 other lay people. And, the whole world kind of laughed because it's preposterous. It's transparently not a valid or legal election. And he died in 2022, and his successor, anti-Pope Michael II, even though he has, a backdrop of St. Peter's on his official image, doesn't actually live in Rome. He lives in the Philippines with his wife and kid. He's just a regular layman. He's not a priest. He's not a bishop. He's certainly not the Bishop of Rome. And he's not recognized by anyone as that. And he wasn't legally elected to that. So it's easy to sort of, laugh at that or mock that, but recognize what's going on here. The reason people are resorting to these kind of wild attempts to illegally elect a pope is because they can't legally elect a pope. Because if they recognize the legal electoral process, they would have to recognize Pope John the 23rd and his successors, all the way down to Pope Francis. So you can't really end up in conclavism because that's just an obviously illegal move. So instead, you're stuck in this position of having to say, well, I guess there's no pope and never will be a pope again. And while I've been focusing in this video on Mel Gibson's form of Sedevacantism, there's another increasingly popular form on the internet now that says, yeah, we're fine with John the 23rd, we're fine with Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, but we don't accept Pope Francis. And the problem is that you end up in the exact same place. Now, one caveat, there are, of course, still cardinals alive who were made cardinals by Benedict XVI and his predecessors. They're not getting any younger, but there are some who still exist. But the problem is, if you think the last valid pope was Benedict XVI and he didn't really resign, you've got the same canonical problem, which is that the election of Pope Francis was governed by the electoral laws set by Benedict XVI. One of the last things he did before announcing his resignation was creating a motu proprio outlining what that electoral process would look like. And he largely just tweaked what John Paul II already had in place, one of the things he lays out is that you have a maximum of 20 days from the beginning of the vacancy of the see. So that 20-day window is triggered by one of two events, depending on how you understand things. Either it was triggered by Pope Benedict resigning, and then you have, within that 20-day process, the beginning of a conclave that elected Pope Francis. Or you could say, I don't believe in any of that, and I actually think that Pope Benedict was still Pope until he died on December 31st, 2022. But even there, it's been more than 20 days, and there's been no conclave. So the fact that we've now gone 2 years, more than 2 years, past that date shows that you couldn't, who, in other words, could possibly call a conclave? Who has the legal authority to do so? And the answer is nobody. And if nobody has the legal authority to call a conclave, then they can't just claim somebody is the Pope. Remember the Western Schism, which I mentioned before? The whole reason you have three different guys at the same time claiming to be Pope is there was a real Pope in Rome. There were a group of disaffected cardinals who didn't like that choice, so they tried to hold their own conclave without legal authority and put their own guy on the throne in Avignon. And he wasn't valid. He wouldn't have been valid even if the Pope in Rome happened to die a moment before they declared their guy as the Pope. It's not a conclave. Even if you have a cardinal, or even if you have multiple cardinals, you need a valid conclave as well. They don't have that. Neither did the ones in Pisa who tried to resolve this situation. So you need not just cardinals, but a conclave. And you can't get a conclave by just ignoring the laws about how you get a conclave. So whether you think that the papacy stops with Pius XII, or whether you think the papacy stops with Benedict XVI, you're stuck in the same place that if you don't accept the line of popes that includes Pope Francis, then you have to say, we not only don't have a pope, we never can have a pope. So that's the first premise of the argument. Second premise of the argument is if we can never have a pope, then Vatican I is false. Not Vatican II, Vatican I. Because Vatican I, Pastor Aeternis, is really clear that we will always have the papacy. We're told explicitly that our Lord Jesus Christ, the Prince of Shepherds and Great Shepherd of the sheep, established in the blessed Apostle Peter for the continual salvation and permanent benefit of the church, the papacy, which must of necessity remain forever by Christ's authority in the church, which, founded as it is upon a rock, will stand firm until the end of time. So, it's kind of a convoluted sentence, or complicated sentence. But what is being very clearly said there by the council is Jesus established the papacy not just for the first generation, not just for the first 20 generations or 20 centuries, but for all time. That the papacy is an ongoing, a perpetual institution. And indeed, Vatican I includes an anathema clause against anyone who would deny this. It says, therefore, if anyone says that it is not by the institution of Christ the Lord himself, that is to say, by divine law, that Blessed Peter should have perpetual successors in the primacy over the whole church, or that the Roman pontiff is not the successor of Blessed Peter in this primacy, let him be anathema. So it includes this clause of damnation, or a clause of anathema, against those who would deny papal succession as a perpetual reality. But notice, if the first premise is right, if Sedevacantism is true, they deny the very thing they're instructed in 1870, not 1970. In 1870, they're told you can't deny that this is a perpetual succession. So, premise one, if the line of popes from John the 23rd to Francis, or even if you just want to say Francis, isn't valid, then we can never have a pope again. Premise two, if we can never have a pope again, Vatican I is false because it uses its authority to declare that that isn't true. The conclusion, therefore, if the line of popes from John the 23rd to Francis isn't valid, then Vatican I is false. Or if you want to take the converse, a more positive version of that, if we can trust Vatican I is true, then we can trust Sedevacantism is false. Like, you can't both believe in the First Vatican Council and Sedevacantism because they have opposite theories of the papacy. And they cannot, as far as I can tell, be harmonized. So that's it in a nutshell. The Sedevacantist views of people like Mel Gibson may be popular because, he's speaking out against church corruption, but in reality, he's articulating a wild theory of a fake papal election that is built on virtually no evidence, contrary to all of the available evidence, and which is theologically precluded by just reading what the First Vatican Council says about the nature of the papacy. For all those reasons, I would suggest we should reject any form of Sedevacantism, and we can trust that the Pope really is the Pope. For Shameless Popery, I'm Joe Heschmeyer. God bless you.